Our red letter lesson today has it all: geography and travel, hope and despair, questions and answers, mystery and revelation, death and resurrection, and enough drama and emotion to keep us talking about it for a long time, years and decades, centuries even. So here's the story in the Bible. On Resurrection Day, what we call the first Easter, Jesus joined two disciples as they walked home from Jerusalem. The story is told in Luke chapter 24. It's known as the walk to Emmaus. Now, Emmaus was a small town a few miles west of Jerusalem. Jerusalem sat on a ridge that ran all the way up and down Israel then and now. And the ground slopes off in both directions. You can go down east, down the Jericho Road to the Sea of the Dead Sea and Jordan River, or you can go down the west side into the maritime plains along the Mediterranean coast, where modern Tel Aviv is. And about halfway, not quite halfway, to Tel Aviv, modern Tel Aviv, you come to the little town of Emmaus. Now, some of you may recognize this phrase, the Emmaus Walk, because the Methodists have taken this as the title of a spiritual retreat, the Walk to Emmaus or the Emmaus Walk. I've known many people who have told me, well, I'll be gone that weekend. I'm going to an Emmaus Walk. These are sponsored by the Upper Room, which is a Christian ministry in Nashville, Tennessee. Maybe you have been on one of these retreats, spiritual retreats, known for their use of silence over 2 days to help people focus and refocus and find a new center of their spiritual life. Walk to Emmaus. I recommend it if you get an opportunity to attend one. Somebody invites you to go along. So the story is these two followers of Jesus, they are unnamed in the text, so we assume that they were not one of the 12 apostles that later became so prominent in the early Christian church. These two followers, they were leaving Jerusalem on the afternoon and evening of what we call the first Easter. And they were going home. They were they'd been through the whole arrest and trial, crucifixion of Jesus. They knew they had put him in a tomb. And they were leaving somewhat dejected. And they are joined by a stranger walking with them. This frequently happens. We meet people when we are traveling, whether it's on bikes or walks or runs or in the car, or if we're in a group traveling overseas. We meet people, we travel with them, we don't know them, and we learn a little bit about them. So these two disciples were walking home in the afternoon, and a stranger begins to walk with them. And the stranger asks them, what's on their mind. And so they turn to this stranger, shocked, and say to him, according to the text we have in the 24th chapter of Luke, say to him, you must be the only person in this whole region that doesn't know what has happened. That is, Jesus, whom they describe as a prophet from Galilee, mighty in word and deed. We had hoped this prophet was to be the one to deliver Israel, and yet they arrested him, they killed him, they put him in a grave. Now they went on to tell the story. Some women went to the tomb this morning and found the tomb empty, but we really don't know what's happened. This was the conversation they had with this man, the stranger. Now, we don't know why they did not recognize Jesus, but you have to remember Mary did not recognize the risen Lord Jesus. We looked at that story 2 weeks ago. Did not recognize Jesus. So he was, of course, the risen Lord, so his body and appearance would have been at least somewhat different. But last week, you remember, we looked at Thomas, who did not believe the stories of Jesus' resurrection and said, I want to see the nail prints in his hand. I want to put my finger in the wound on his side. That is, Thomas assumed that there would be some things that would be the same, some things that he could touch and feel and see that would convince him that a person was Jesus. And indeed, that's what happened according to the story in John's Gospel. And here we are in this resurrection story with Luke. And they did not recognize Jesus. And they were disappointed. Now, I still find it telling, and I'm not sure what it tells, that these men who were followers of Jesus, at some level anyway, that they were leaving Jerusalem so quickly after the burial of Jesus. They stayed around for Saturday, they stayed around for Sunday. There were reports of the empty tomb, but they were still going home. They were dejected. And so it must have been nighttime. They invited this stranger to stay over with them. He apparently was going further down the road, and they invited him to stay, apparently for dinner and for overnight. And he did. And while they were there, he talked to them about his interpretation of the Bible. The text says that he explained to them why the one that they wanted to be their Redeemer and leader, why he instead was crucified and buried and was no longer in the place that they thought he could lead them and lead Israel into a revival or a renaissance or an awakening or an enlightenment. And it concludes with this question. I'm going to read this to you. These men asked themselves this question: did not our hearts burn within us as he talked to us and explained the scriptures to us? That is a question that's in the text. I want to stop and talk about that for just a minute. I want to say, first of all, that I've heard my father preach on this text a number of times. It was one of his favorite stories in the Bible, one of his favorite verses, one of his favorite questions in the Bible to talk about, because he rightly understood it as describing a common experience that Christians have who have an emotional reaction to hearing somebody read and interpret the scriptures in a way that is compelling, the way that is convincing, the way that is emotionally powerful to us. I've had that experience many times in my life as I heard people that I respected either preach a sermon or give a testimony or lead a Bible study or even in a classroom give a talk about how to interpret the scriptures, opening it up for us. Now, I want to say something about this question. This is one of 6 questions in this story. You want to know how I know that? Well, a number of years ago, when I was a pastor in Owensboro, Kentucky, all the small children in one of the Bible school classes came into my study and sat down and talked to me. This was an annual thing. I think it was like the second graders or something like that. And they would all come in, and I don't know, there were 15 or 20 of them that year, and they sat on the couch and the chairs and stood around. Some of them sat on the floor. And one of them, in the course of the conversation, they asked all kinds of questions. They asked me this question: how many Bibles do you have? And I thought, well, I don't know. I said, why don't we count them? And so I went over to my shelf on the wall where all the books and Bibles were, and I said to them, I'm going to point to the Bibles and you count out loud and we'll find out. So I began to point to the Bibles 1, 2, 3, 4, 10, 11, 12, 13. I had all kinds of English language Bibles in all kinds of translations, but I also had other languages, including the Hebrew Bible and the Greek Bible, a couple of volumes of the Greek Bible. I had a modern translation Hebrew. I had a Bible in French and one in Arabic. And so we got to 20 and 21, 22, 23, and it got up to 30. And I thought, oh my, this is more than I thought. 31, 32, 33, 34. We got up to 40, 41, 42, 42 Bibles in my library at that time. Of course, I still see Bibles I wish I had a copy of, a new translation or a new study Bible, or at my age, a large letter edition, large print edition. But among the Bibles that I pointed to that day and they counted was this Bible right here. Hardback, the New Oxford Annotated Bible with the Apocrypha. Well, I'll talk about the Apocrypha someday. This is the New Revised Standard Version. And I bring it to your attention because sometime in my life and ministry, I decided to count the questions in the Bible. I've always been attracted to the questions in the Bible. I've preached many times a series, Questions of the Soul, or the questions in the book of Genesis, questions in the life of Jesus, questions in the letters of Paul. Because the question is something that immediately grips the attention of the hearer. When somebody is speaking and asks a question, you can hardly keep from stopping and answering the question. There's something in the human psyche that is drawn to a question. And I like questions in general. I think questions are one of the key features of being a human. We like to ask questions. Questions are the key to scientific discovery. They are the key to finding the truth. Questions drive our learning and our study. They determine our discovery and revelation. Questions help us to push back against superstition and trickery. Questions help us discern right from wrong, truth from error, the real from an illusion. So I started counting. Actually, I started at the beginning, and I'm not going to say I read through the whole Bible. I want to say I thumbed through every page and counted the question marks. Now, you know that in the ancient Hebrew language, there was no punctuation. Actually, the same is true of Greek. That where we have punctuation, like capital letters and periods and commas and question marks and exclamation points, these are all put in there by the translators and the interpreters. As a matter of fact, in the Hebrew, they did not even use the vowels, only the consonants. So you can understand how translations vary one from another. So when you take a Bible like this and thumb through it and underline every question mark, you're responding to the way some translators, some interpreters have read the ancient Hebrew and Greek and turned them into modern sentences with punctuation and paragraphs and chapters and all of that. You know how many questions I found? 2,550, give or take. And that give or take is especially important today. When I opened up this Bible today to read this study, I discovered something. I had underlined 5 question marks in this text. But yet, as I read it through again, I discovered that there was one that I had omitted. This has been 20 years ago when I counted all these questions. And it's the very one that we have today that I was reading to you. Here are the questions. The first one, Jesus said to those two disciples, "What are you discussing with each other as you're walking along?" A very common, ordinary way. This is kind of a structured way of saying, what are you talking about? What's on your mind? And then they ask him a question. Are you the only person in Jerusalem who does not know about the things that have happened? Jesus responded with a question. What things? And they began to tell him about Jesus. Jesus then begins to open the Bible, not that they had a copy, but he was quoting Scripture and interpreting it. And Jesus said to them, "Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" These are the questions that drove this story. Many stories are driven by questions and answers, the dialogue. And then, after they had eaten with him, they turned to one another and said, "Did not our hearts burn within us?" Didn't you have an emotional reaction, one said to the other? What were you feeling inside of you as you heard Jesus talk and read the Scriptures and as we sat around the table and ate dinner together? What were you feeling deep inside? This is a question that we can often ask one another about what's going on. All of this story came rushing back to me this week. A woman that I know, the wife of a young minister, she posted something on Facebook. You remember last Sunday, as I said, I asked you to pray for a young minister, 42 years old, Jeremy Schulte. He's from Louisville, Kentucky. He's a graduate of Georgetown College. I don't remember whether I had him in class. That is, when I was teaching. He was also a graduate of the Baptist Seminary of Kentucky, where I served as interim president in 2016. But Jeremy Schulte was very sick. I had gone to see him a week ago Thursday. Went to the hospital, Emory University Hospital in Atlanta. The whole family was there. And I told you about this last Sunday in the house. I went back and looked at the recording of that broadcast. I talked about him from 9:11 to 9:15 Eastern Standard Time last Sunday morning. And as I was talking about him, literally, he was dying. The time was eventually listed as 9:15, and his wife posted this on Facebook, quote, "For the life of my husband, Jeremy, with whom I've shared all of my happiness for 20 years, thanks be to God." October 11th, 1983, April 12th, 2026. It is such a sad statement and also so inspirational. When I read it, I was alone. I thought to myself, what an elegant sentence, what a spiritual statement, so full of truth and emotion. I've thought about it all week, that phrase especially, all my happiness. I'm going to leave today, this afternoon, drive over to Gainesville, Georgia to help officiate at that funeral. I'm going to read part of the text. But here's another reason I'm going to read part of this text. Jeremy Schulte was a young seminary student when in January of 2010, he was one of the 92 young preachers who came to the inaugural Festival of Young Preachers. Some of you know that for about 10 years, I launched and led the the Academy of Preachers. We had festivals all over the country, national festivals, regional festivals, denominational festivals, where young people who were discerning a call to preach came to preach a sermon. We gave them 15 minutes to preach, which was twice as long as the Catholic kids needed and not half as long as the Pentecostal preachers needed. I'll have to confess that one of my students at Georgetown College, a Pentecostal preacher now out in Missouri, preached for 26 minutes, and I was there in the room where he was preaching, and I kept wishing he'd wrap it up. You've probably felt that often in listening to a preacher. He took 26 minutes instead of the 15 we allotted him, but Jeremy came to preach, and he preached that day from this text. We published his sermon in our book of sermons that year. The book is called A Beautiful Thing, because Lee Huckleberry, who was my associate and edited this book, wrote in the preface, on January the 7th, 2010, a beautiful thing took place in Louisville, Kentucky. I've always loved that sentence. I encouraged him to name the book A Beautiful Thing, Sermons from the Inaugural Festival of Young Preachers. On page 250 is Jeremy's sermon, The Road to Emmaus. And he talks about the mixture of hope and despair in the human experience. Those two disciples on the road were people, ordinary people, followers of Jesus, trying to discern what it meant to believe in God, follow Jesus, and live in the fullness of the Spirit. They were people just like you and me. It's a terrific sermon. I've read it several times this week, and I liked especially the way the sermon concludes with two questions. How will you be the presence of Christ as you walk alongside those who think that all hope is lost? There's so many layers to that question that young preacher asked 16 years ago that speaks so powerfully now to the situation of the hundreds of people that are in mourning over his untimely and unwanted death. And then this final question, how will you be the image of Christ to all of those who are in need of such marvelous grace? How will you be the presence of Christ? I don't know of two better questions to ask. Not only at the end of this text, this story, this homily, this red letter lesson, but at the end of any testimony, any sermon, any red letter lesson. Now I want to speak to one final thing about this. I want you to think for a minute what lasting impact this episode must have had on those two unnamed disciples on that afternoon, the first day of the week. Sometimes experiences that we have, good and bad, shape us for the rest of our lives. Sometimes terror and tragedy, which is happening all over the world, shape us physically, financially, vocationally, emotionally, spiritually, for the rest of our lives. And sometimes wonderful things, hearing something, seeing something, feeling something, meeting a person, has such power in our lives that reshapes us forever. I want you to think of it. Let's take a scientific metaphor, like the Big Bang. Scientists really don't know how to explain how everything came into being. We as believers say God created it, but scientists always look for a natural explanation to things. And they have this theory that there was a Big Bang an explosion at the beginning of things that has had enough energy, enough power, enough direction to fuel the universe ever since. As a matter of fact, they say that the universe is continuing to expand right now, today, because of the energy that came out of the Big Bang. I think this might be a productive way to think about our spiritual experiences, how things can happen to us, things that have such power in our lives, emotional power, intellectual power, spiritual power, even vocational power. I sometimes think of my own teenage years in this way when I was 15, 16, and 17 and was involved in a powerful movement, spiritual movement in our church and community, in which I felt the Lord calling me not only to be a disciple and to take seriously everything Jesus was calling me to, but also to wooing me into the ministry that I have followed now for 60 years. That the emotional and spiritual vocational power of that, I want to say, Big Bang, that explosion in my life, that series of events when I was a teenager, has carried me through for these 60 years. Maybe you've had an experience like that. And sometimes when we're called upon to give a testimony, that's what we want to talk. Sometimes we'll talk about something that happened last week, how God answered a prayer or brought us a new friend or healed us of some ailment. But sometimes we want to go further back to the Big Bang in our own spiritual life. I can remember with great detail so many things about that Big Bang in my own life. And I suspect these two disciples walking along that pathway, encountering Jesus, whom they did not recognize. They said it like this: did not our hearts burn within us? And I suspect that burning lasted a long time. I suspect even when they were old people, they were talking about what they felt and heard and saw and experienced that day. That's my red letter lesson for today. Thank you for being with me today in the house, as we say. I hope you've had some experiences like that in your life. I hope you yet will have experiences like this, where you are moved powerfully, where your mind and soul and spirit are reshaped and redirected, re-energized, and you can say, it was the Lord who came to me when I most needed it. Thank you for joining me today in the house. Just one word before we leave. I've been talking to you about my Tangle tour of 26, and I'm here to report again that on October the 10th, a Saturday afternoon in Owensboro, Kentucky, at the Owensboro Museum of Fine Art, we will have an event that's focused on books and art. My traveling team will be there with me, especially my son Isaac. The museum is going to exhibit, do an exhibition of his artwork. He is going to present, talk about, and sign copies of his new book of art. You can join us. That is October the 10th, a Saturday afternoon from 1 to 4 in Owensboro, Kentucky. That's stop number 3 on the Tangle Tour of 26. We're going to be in Greenville, Nashville, Owensboro, Louisville, Covington, Lexington, and then, the Lord willing, back in Hendersonville, North Carolina. You can meet us along the way. We're going to have a good time. We're going to tell some stories. We're going to sell some books. And we're going to broadcast it all. God bless you all on this Lord's Day. Pray for me as I leave this afternoon to drive over to Gainesville. Pray for the Schulte family as they gather tonight to say an untimely goodbye to somebody that we all honored and loved. God bless you all. I'm Dwight Moody. This has been Sunday in the Meeting House. I hope you have a good and godly day.